Okay, strap yourselves in because today we are going deep into some really fascinating stuff. President Trump's second term inauguration and the whole world of online conspiracy theories.
It's a lot.
It is a lot, and you have given me a ton of sources here.
I have.
Some of them are, pretty mainstream, and others
Yeah.
are maybe a little further out there.
A little bit.
Yeah,
It's a real mix,
it really is.
which I think reflects the
It does.
media landscape we're in right now.
It totally does.
It's like
Yeah.
everyone's getting their news from such different places.
Yeah, and we've got the actual news clips from the inauguration itself. We have commentary from a pretty right-leaning show.
Okay.
And then we have, well, some takes on current events that are definitely unique.
Yes.
So how do we even
Love that kind of-
begin to make sense of all of this?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
It
I
is.
mean, how do we sort through all this?
Yeah.
And try to connect the dots and hopefully give our listeners a way to kind of understand this whole
This whole world.
information jungle.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah, let's jump in.
first things first, Trump is back in the White House for a second inauguration. This is January 20th, 2025, after
Oh,
a
wow.
pretty unusual
Yeah.
gap between terms.
Definitely unusual, unprecedented, really.
Unprecedented.
And the reactions have been fascinating.
Yeah,
I mean, really all over the map.
they really have been.
You've got folks on Rumble. Certain channels are absolutely celebrating.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, like they're ecstatic.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got shows like The Rubin Report
Yeah.
taking a much more critical stance.
Yeah, it's so interesting how the tone is just so different,
It really is.
depending on where you're looking.
It's a different world.
It
And
is.
depending on where you look for your information these days.
It is. And speaking of Rumble, you sent me a bunch of sources that come
Sure.
from Rumble.
Hey,
So what's the deal with that platform?
Well, Rumble's interesting.
Oh.
It's a video platform. It's become really a hub for right-leaning audiences.
Interesting.
It's been growing like crazy.
Right.
They host all sorts of stuff.
Like what?
News commentary. You can even find like Dr. Disrespect's streaming on there.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this platform that seems to lean a certain way, and it's hosting some pretty intense reactions to Trump's second term. What's the overall vibe you're getting?
Well, there's a sense of vindication, I'd say, among some of his supporters.
Mhm.
Like they feel like their beliefs have been validated.
Okay.
On the other hand, you also see this heightened anxiety,
Oh, really?
like a feeling that the stakes are even higher now.
Interesting. Okay, so what about the inauguration itself? Did anything particularly stand out to you?
Well, the Rubin Report had this headline: "No one expected these brutal moments in Trump's inauguration speech."
Wow.
It makes you wonder what went down.
It really does.
Right.
Yeah.
And boom, right out of the gate.
Yeah,
Trump signs a bunch of executive orders.
he does. One of them was a reissue of his 2020 order
Forward.
about removing rogue bureaucrats.
That was a controversial one.
It was.
I mean, the original order
Yeah.
was seen by some as an attempt to just purge the government
Right.
of anyone who didn't agree with him.
Wow, so reissuing it now.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
It suggests that he's doubling down on that approach.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder about the implications
It does.
for, the federal workforce.
For sure.
So is this tied to those deep state anxieties that we see in some of the sources you've sent?
It's hard to say for sure,
Okay.
but there's definitely a connection.
Okay.
That idea that there's this hidden network within the government working against Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a recurring theme in a lot of
Yeah.
the more alternative sources you sent me.
Right, and it seems like that is directly tied to this other executive order, the one about establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Right.
He wants to investigate what he calls deep state spying, censorship, and corruption.
Okay.
And the language he's using is so strong.
It is.
He talks about, exposing hoaxes and abuses of power that have been tearing our country apart.
Yeah, it's like a lightning rod,
It is.
that order.
Yeah.
It's attracting all these anxieties
Yeah.
about government overreach
Mhm.
and just a general distrust of institutions.
Right.
It feeds into that narrative we see online.
Okay, so let's wade into those alternative perspectives a bit.
Okay.
The Thrive Time show,
Yeah.
Liz Crokin, they're really focused on these conspiracy theories,
They are.
especially around CBDCs, central bank digital currencies.
Yes.
And just to be clear to our listeners,
Of course.
we're not endorsing these theories at all.
No. We're just trying to understand them.
Yeah.
That's our goal here.
Yeah, we're trying to understand them.
Right.
So they're centered around figures like Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, Yuval Noah Harari, and
Yeah. You see those names pop up a lot.
yeah, and the language, again, is pretty intense.
Oh, yeah.
Things like quantum dots plus quant currency, total control.
Yeah, they love that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So for those of us who are not,
Yeah.
deep in this world,
Right.
what are CBDCs and why are they causing such a stir?
Well, in the simplest terms, a CBDC is like a digital version of a country's regular money,
Okay.
but it's issued and managed by the central bank.
Okay.
And the controversy comes from what that could mean
Yeah.
for privacy and how much control the government might have.
So there's this potential for good,
Right.
like in making transactions more efficient and giving more people access to financial services.
Right. And even people who are in favor of exploring CBDCs
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge those benefits.
Okay.
In fact, Lev Mostry, who is the CEO of Euroclear and a member of the World Economic Forum, he said, "We are on the journey to CBDCs, and the journey is going to happen."
Wow.
So this is not just some fringe idea.
No.
This is something that's being seriously considered
Okay.
by people in positions of power.
But at the same time, you have that fear of the government being able to track every dollar you spend.
Well, absolutely.
Maybe even restrict your spending or freeze your assets.
Absolutely. And that fear
Yeah.
is exactly what fuels those conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
When you add in distrust of figures like Bill Gates
Right.
and organizations like the World Economic Forum,
Uh-huh.
well, it's a recipe for these narratives to take hold.
Which brings us to the Great Reset,
Oh, yes.
which is another term that comes up a lot in these sources. So can you give us the rundown on that?
Sure.
What is it and why is it at the heart of so many of these conspiracy theories?
Well, the Great Reset is an initiative launched by the World Economic Forum.
It's a real thing.
It is a real thing.
Okay.
It's about addressing global challenges.
Like what?
Things like climate change, inequality,
Yeah.
the rapid pace of technological change.
Okay.
But the way some people interpret it,
Uh-huh.
it's like a blueprint for a global takeover with elites calling all the shots.
Wow.
I mean, you see reactions like Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum are going to hell.
That's intense.
It is.
Okay, so we have Trump back in office,
Right.
executive orders targeting the deep state,
Uh,
and these anxieties about CBDCs and the Great Reset are swirling online.
they are.
How do we even begin to connect the dots here?
I think the common thread is this deep distrust of institutions,
Okay.
this fear of control, and this feeling that the average person is being manipulated by powerful forces,
By who?
whether it's the government, big tech, global organizations. There's this sense that something is amiss,
Yeah.
that things are not what they seem.
Yeah, it's like everyone is looking for an explanation,
Yeah.
trying to make sense of a world that just feels increasingly chaotic
Yes.
and uncertain.
And in that search for answers, sometimes people land on explanations
Yeah.
that might not be entirely grounded in reality.
Right.
But that doesn't mean their fears and anxieties aren't real.
They're real people with real concerns.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we need to take those concerns seriously.
We do. It's like we're trying to untangle this giant web of information, and every time we pull on one thread, like two more appear.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that's why we need some kind of like a framework.
A framework. Yeah.
And to understand all of this, we can't just like get bogged down in every single claim and every, bit of information we have.
Yeah.
To kind of step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
The historical context, the trends that are driving the forces at play.
Yeah. Okay, I'm with you. So far, we've talked about Trump's those executive orders that he signed immediately, and then these anxieties that seem to fuel certain conspiracy theories. Where do we go from here?
Well, I think one place to go is to look at the connection between Trump's agenda and the rise of these alternative media platforms,
Okay.
like Rumble.
Interesting. So are you saying there's like a feedback loop happening here?
I think so.
Like
yeah.
his rhetoric appeals to people who already distrust the mainstream media.
Right.
So they turn to platforms like Rumble. And then Rumble in turn kind of amplifies the very narratives that reinforce those beliefs.
It's a symbiotic relationship,
It is.
and it's creating a completely different information environment than what we've been used to.
And what are the consequences of that? I mean, does it really matter where people get their news from?
It matters a lot, actually.
Yeah.
For one thing, it becomes much harder to have productive conversations
Okay.
across different viewpoints
Yeah.
when people are getting their news from such different sources,
Right.
with completely different agendas and perspectives. Well, finding common ground
Right.
becomes a real challenge.
And doesn't it also increase the risk of just misinformation spreading?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, think about how algorithms work.
Yeah.
They're designed to keep you engaged.
Right.
right? And
Yeah.
sometimes that means feeding you content that's emotionally charged or maybe not entirely accurate,
Right.
even if it keeps you scrolling and clicking.
So you get stuck in like a bubble.
Exactly.
Right.
It's easy to get stuck in that bubble of confirmation bias.
So what's the solution?
Wow.
What can we do about this?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And there are no easy answers.
Right.
But I think the first step is becoming more aware of our own biases.
Okay, that sounds good in theory, but how do we even know what our biases are? It feels like we're all just drowning in information these days.
We are.
Just trying to keep our heads above water.
That's where critical thinking skills become crucial.
Okay.
We need to constantly question our assumptions, look for diverse perspectives, and most importantly, be open to changing our minds
Oh,
when presented with new evidence.
so you're not saying we should like try to shut down platforms like Rumble or censor certain viewpoints?
I don't think that's the answer.
Okay.
I think that might even be counterproductive.
Okay.
The more we try to suppress information, the more likely it is to spread in secret and become even more extreme.
Okay, so what's the alternative then? How do we encourage people to be more discerning about the information they consume?
Well, for starters, we need to promote media literacy.
Okay.
We need to teach people how to evaluate information, recognize bias, think critically.
Yeah, and we need to encourage respectful dialogue, even when people disagree, right?
Absolutely.
It's okay to have different opinions,
Yes.
but we need to be able to talk about them constructively.
We need to create spaces where people feel comfortable sharing their perspectives without feeling attacked or threatened.
That sounds great, but it's a tall order, especially in the current political climate.
It is.
It feels like everyone is so dug into their positions that there's no room for like compromise or even civil discussion.
It's definitely a challenge, but I believe it's essential
Yeah.
if we want to bridge these divides and avoid even more polarization.
Okay, I'm with you on that. So how do we even start? What's the first step towards creating this kind of environment?
Honestly, I think this deep dive is a good start.
Okay.
By exploring these complex issues, looking at different sources, and having this thoughtful discussion, we're moving in the right direction.
I like that it's not about having all the answers,
Yeah.
but about asking the right questions. And speaking of questions, let's get back to those conspiracy theories swirling around CBDCs and the Great Reset.
Okay.
You mentioned figures like Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab earlier. What role do they play in these theories?
Well, they're often painted as the masterminds
Okay.
behind some grand scheme to control the world, through technology, finance, surveillance, that kind of thing.
So they become like the villains.
They become these larger-than-life villains in the narrative.
Okay, and what evidence do people point to support these claims?
Well, they'll bring up things like Bill Gates' investments in vaccine development
Huh?
or Klaus Schwab's writings about the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
Okay, but are those really signs of like some sinister plot?
Right.
Or are they just examples of powerful people with ambitious ideas? I mean, is it possible to be influential and wealthy
Right.
without being part of some global conspiracy?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We need to be careful not to confuse correlation with causation. Just because someone is wealthy and influential and maybe has expressed some controversial views doesn't automatically make them part of a global cabal.
Okay, so how do we separate legitimate concerns from the more outlandish claims?
Right?
How do we know when to take something seriously and when to just dismiss it as like another crazy conspiracy theory?
Well, it comes down to being discerning consumers of information.
Okay.
We need to carefully examine the evidence, consider the source of the information, and always be aware of our own biases.
For example, I've seen a lot of claims online about quantum dots being used to track people through vaccines.
Ah, yes, the quantum dot conspiracy.
Is that a thing?
That's a classic.
Really?
The idea is that these tiny nanocrystals, which can emit light under certain conditions,
Okay.
are being injected into people to create some kind of biometric surveillance system.
Wow.
It plays into that fear of being constantly monitored, of having no privacy.
And is there any truth to that? Are quantum dots even a real thing?
Quantum dots are real, and they're being explored for various medical applications,
Like what?
including drug delivery and imaging.
So theoretically, they could be used for tracking?
Theoretically, yes,
Okay.
but there's no credible evidence to suggest that's actually happening.
Okay.
And even if the technology existed, that doesn't mean it's being used for nefarious purposes.
Right.
We have to remember that technology itself is neutral.
Uh-huh.
It's how we choose to use it that determines whether it's beneficial or harmful.
So it all comes back to context and interpretation.
It does.
You can't just look at a piece of information in isolation. You have to consider the source, the agenda.
Yeah.
the broader context.
Exactly. And we need to be wary of jumping to conclusions based on fear or speculation.
Yeah.
Critical thinking is about questioning those knee-jerk reactions and looking for evidence before forming an opinion.
Okay, so we've talked about quantum dots, but what about the Great Reset itself?
Right.
Is that just a conspiracy theory, or is there something to it? Is there any reason to be concerned?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Great Reset is an actual initiative launched by the World Economic Forum.
Okay, so it's not just some fantasy made up by conspiracy theorists.
No, it's a real thing.
Uh-huh.
But the question is, how do we interpret it?
Okay.
Proponents of the Great Reset argue that it's a necessary response to global challenges like climate change, inequality, technological disruption.
Okay.
They believe that we need to fundamentally rethink our economic and social systems to create a more sustainable and equitable future.
That sounds reasonable enough, so where does the conspiracy come in?
Well, critics see it as a power grab by elites,
Okay.
a way to consolidate control and impose their agenda on the world.
Uh-huh.
They believe that it will lead to a loss of individual freedoms and the rise of some kind of global technocracy.
So who's right? Is the Great Reset a genuine attempt to solve global problems or a sinister plot to control the world?
That's the tricky part. There are valid concerns on both sides of this debate.
Okay.
It's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric and miss the nuances.
So how do we make sense of it all? It feels like we're constantly being pulled in different directions, bombarded with all this conflicting information.
I know, it is exhausting.
It's exhausting.
And that's why it's important to remember that the future isn't predetermined.
Okay.
We have agency, we have a voice, and we have the power to shape the world we want to live in.
So it's not about giving up hope or surrendering to fear.
Absolutely not. It's about being informed,
Yeah.
staying engaged, and empowering ourselves to make a difference.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passive observers. We're active participants in shaping the future.
I love that. So where do we go from here? What's the next step in our deep dive into all of this?
I think it's time to shift our focus to the individual.
Okay.
How are these global trends, these anxieties, impacting people on a personal level?
Yeah.
How are they affecting the way we think, the way we interact with each other, the way we make decisions?
That's a great question, and it's one we're going to explore in more depth after a quick break. Stay with us. And we are back for the final part of this deep dive into, well, it's been a journey.
It has been a journey.
It has been President Trump's second term inauguration, those alternative media platforms, and then all these conspiracy theories that we keep seeing.
And now it's time to kind of bring it all home.
Yeah.
And see how these big trends, these big ideas, these big forces
Mhm.
affect, each individual person.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about, global events, national politics in a detached way,
Right.
but then to feel the impact in your own life,
Yeah,
in your community, in your own headspace, that's a whole other thing.
exactly. It's not just about the headlines. It's about how these things filter down and shape the way we see the world.
So let's revisit those anxieties we talked about earlier, that fear of control, distrust of authority, the feeling that you're being manipulated or watched.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not just paranoia, right?
No, those anxieties are understandable.
Yeah,
I mean, think about it. The pace of technology is insane.
it really is.
Power seems concentrated in fewer and fewer hands.
Yeah.
Trust in traditional institutions
Yeah.
is eroding.
It's a recipe for uncertainty.
It really does feel like the ground is constantly shifting.
It does.
It's hard to feel stable when you don't even know it's real anymore.
Exactly. And when people are searching for that stability, for answers, in a world that feels so chaotic,
Yeah?
well, they often gravitate towards narratives that provide a sense of order,
Even if those narratives are
even if they're not entirely
totally real.
Yeah.
Grounded, in fact.
Yeah, and that's where those conspiracy theories come in.
Exactly. They offer a framework for understanding events that might otherwise seem random or confusing.
Right. It makes you feel like you've uncovered some hidden truth.
Right, like you're in the know.
Yeah.
Even if that truth is based on shaky ground.
And there's an appeal to that, isn't there?
There is.
That feeling of agency.
Totally.
Like you're not just a passive victim.
Right.
You're fighting back.
You're fighting back against powerful forces, even if those forces are largely imagined.
So even if some of these theories are a little out there, they're still reflecting very real concerns that people have.
Absolutely.
It's not like these anxieties just come out of nowhere.
No, we can't just brush them aside as crazy or irrational.
Right.
It's crucial to listen to those concerns, to try to understand where they're coming from, because often beneath the surface of even the most outlandish conspiracy theory, you'll find a kernel of truth,
Yeah.
a real societal issue that's being twisted and amplified.
So maybe these anxieties are less about specific events or figures and more about just a deeper unease
I think you're
with
right.
how the world is right now.
We're dealing with a sense of alienation, a
Yeah.
loss of community,
Yeah.
a lack of faith in the future.
Yeah, these are some deep-seated issues that can't be solved with a simple solution.
No.
So where do we go from here? What's the antidote to all this widespread anxiety and distrust?
Well, it's not about having all the answers.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together.
Yeah.
We have to find ways to rebuild trust, to have open and honest conversations, to create spaces where people feel heard and respected.
And it sounds like it's also about empowering people to take action.
Yes.
To feel like they can actually make a difference instead of just being swept along by all these forces that they can't control.
That's a key part of it, whether it's getting involved in local politics, supporting organizations that align with your values, or just having honest conversations with your family and friends
Yeah.
about these issues. Every little bit helps.
So this isn't just about, debunking conspiracy theories or fact-checking every single claim that comes across our feeds.
It's bigger than that.
It's bigger than that.
It's about addressing those root causes,
Yeah.
those underlying societal issues that create fertile ground for misinformation and distrust to take root.
It's about fostering a sense of hope,
Yes.
a belief that we can actually build a better future together.
It's a powerful vision, and it's a lot more inspiring than dwelling on fear and suspicion.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a few thoughts to ponder.
Okay.
We've journeyed through the political landscape, the rise of alternative media, and those anxieties fueling those conspiracy theories. But the most important takeaway is this. You have the power to shape your own reality.
That's right.
Choose your sources wisely. Think critically about the information you consume and engage in constructive dialogue, even with people who disagree with you.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Don't let fear or manipulation dictate your beliefs or your actions. Stay informed, stay engaged, and be part of the solution.
The future isn't set in stone. It's up to each of us to create the world we want to live in.
And on that note, we'll leave you to your own deep dives. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay curious.